You know, I was reading an article just the other day about how many more countries are putting military satellites up these days. And it really hit me. Space is going to be the next big battlefield, which is why this deep dive into the new Space Capstone publication is so perfect. It's basically the U.S. Space Force's playbook for this whole new world we're facing.
Yeah, it's a huge turning point. Like, for years, space was this thing off to the side. Not really on the same level as fighting on land or sea or in the air or even cyber. But this
But
document, it finally puts space power right up there with the rest of them as its own military domain.
And not just on the same level, right? Yeah, it feels like space is moving to the head of the pack. What makes space power so different? What can you do in space that you just can't pull off anywhere else?
It all comes down to what makes space, well, space. Take something like, let's say, orbital flight. The fact that spacecraft can reach these crazy speeds and cover huge distances, it basically gives us eyes and ears everywhere on the planet, instantly.
So we're talking about speed, global reach, but it's not like satellites need to stop and refuel like jets, right?
Exactly. We're talking persistence and endurance. Satellites can stay up there for years, decades even. They're always watching, and they see a lot more than anything on the ground ever could.
That's amazing. Like having a bunch of eyes in the sky that never blink.
Hmm.
But just having space power, that's only the first step, yeah.
Yeah.
What are we, the U.S. Space Force, actually supposed to do with it?
That's where the Space Capstone publication lays it out. Three core responsibilities: preserving freedom of action in space, enabling what they call joint lethality and effectiveness, and then providing independent options for the leaders of the country.
Okay, I can kind of see how those would work in a big picture way. But what do those responsibilities actually mean for someone in the Space Force day to day?
So take preserving freedom of action. It means we don't just launch stuff up there and hope for the best. We've got to make sure our satellites can actually operate safely without anyone or anything messing with them. So you've got all the work being done on space situational awareness, tracking debris, figuring out how to defend our stuff. That's all about making sure we can actually use space.
So for a Space Force member, we could be talking about anything from watching for other satellites to literally building defense systems, right?
Exactly. And then there's enabling joint lethality and effectiveness. This is where the Space Force makes all the other branches even stronger. Think about GPS. Totally essential for precise strikes, moving troops, you name it.
So someone in the Space Force who works on TPS, they're not just stuck in the space domain. They're affecting what happens on the ground, in the air, at sea.
Exactly. And how well they do their jobs, it's crucial for missions everywhere. And then lastly, there's providing independent options for the people at the top.
This one sounds a little more, how do I put this, hush-hush. Are we talking about, like, offensive capabilities up in space?
The document's vague on purpose, but it stresses that space gives us tools that you just don't get anywhere else. It's about having choices, especially when the usual military options are off the table, or it just wouldn't be a good idea.
So for our Space Force folks out there, we could be talking about anything from making brand new tech to digging through intel to advising the president.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Space Force so cool. It's not just one job, you're part of a whole new way of keeping the country safe.
Sounds like you need a lot of different skills in the Space Force. It's not all fighter pilots and rocket scientists, right?
Oh, absolutely not. We need people who get cybersecurity, international relations, even psychology. This is new territory. We're still figuring out the rules of the game as we go.
So we've got these three core responsibilities, or marching orders, like you said.
Yeah.
But how do we actually achieve them? Feels like we need some specific tools or skills for that, right?
That's where the five core competencies come in. Think of them as the specialized tools in our toolbox. They're how we get those big responsibilities done.
Okay, let's crack open that toolbox and see what we've got. What's the first core competency?
First up, you've got space security. You could say it's priority number one, keeping all our stuff up there safe from anything and everything.
When you say threats, what exactly are we talking about? I'm guessing it's a little more complicated than just dodging asteroids these days. Right?
Oh, yeah, way more complicated. We're talking about direct attacks on our satellites, things like anti-satellite missiles, lasers, even cyber attacks that could fry our systems from, who knows how far away. And then there are the less direct threats, but they're still a huge deal, like space debris.
That's what I was thinking about. All those old satellites and pieces of rockets just zipping around up there.
Yeah.
Hear about that Kessler syndrome, and it's kind of freaky.
Exactly. Kessler syndrome, that's the nightmare scenario. One crash causes another, and you end up with this chain reaction of debris that makes whole areas of space unusable, like for centuries. So space security, it's about knowing what's out there, knowing what could happen, and having ways to fight back.
Makes sense. What's the next tool we've got?
Next, we've got combat power projection. I know that one gets people thinking about, lasers and blowing stuff up in space, but it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Okay, so what does combat power projection really mean for the U.S. Space Force?
It means we don't just defend from space, we can also project power from up there. Think about being able to give troops on the ground real-time intel, or watching enemy movements from orbit. Things you just couldn't do from down here.
So even if we're not talking about Star Wars just yet, the information and the things we can do from space can have a huge impact on battles down on Earth, right?
Exactly. It's all about working together. Our assets up in space, they can change the game for everyone else, give us the edge.
Gotcha. Okay, what's next in our core competency list?
Number 3 is space mobility and logistics. This one's all about moving around in space and keeping things running smoothly up there.
So are we talking about building those giant spinning space stations you see in the movies? Or maybe mining asteroids for resources? That's always seemed like a long shot, even to someone like me who doesn't know a whole lot about space.
Those are still a ways off, honestly. Right now, this competency is about getting a lot better at operating in space. We need to get more efficient, more self-sufficient.
That makes sense. If we really want to be up there for the long haul, we can't always rely on these expensive launches from Earth.
Exactly. Think about being able to move satellites around quickly when you need to, or sending repair crews to fix something without having to launch a whole new mission from Earth. Space mobility and logistics, it's about building the systems and tech to do all that.
Sounds like a completely different way of thinking about space travel.
For sure. It's a long game, but we've got to start playing it now.
Okay, what's the next core competency? We're really getting a sense of just how much the Space Force does.
Right, so next up is information mobility. This one's all about making sure info gets to and from space without any problems, making sure our communications are rock solid and our data is safe, even if there are cyber attacks or other things trying to mess us up.
That sounds especially important these days with all the cyber warfare going on.
It's absolutely essential. Think about it, almost everything we do up in space, from knowing where our satellites are to gathering intelligence, it all depends on a steady stream of data.
So someone could attack our systems on the ground, and it would be just as bad as hitting a satellite directly.
Exactly. That's why information mobility isn't just about having good Wi-Fi in space. It's about building secure networks, top-notch encryption, and really strong defenses against hackers. It's about making sure our space systems can do their jobs no matter what's happening down here.
It really drives home how connected everything is these days, even in space. All right, what's our last core competency?
The last one, and it's a big one, is space domain awareness, or SDA. Think of it as knowing absolutely everything that's going on in space. Where all the satellites are, all the debris, even what the space weather's like.
So like a super high-tech air traffic control, but for space?
Even more than that, it's not just about knowing where things are, it's about really understanding space itself. Like space weather, it can mess up our satellites, cause malfunctions, even make them totally die.
Oh, wow, I hadn't thought about that. Makes sense, though. We need to know about solar flares and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole space debris problem we've already talked about. SDA is about keeping track of all that junk, figuring out when it might hit something, and figuring out how to stop it.
It sounds like this space domain awareness, it's really the starting point for everything else we've talked about.
Yeah.
You can't protect yourself. You can't use space to your advantage. You can't even operate up there if you don't know what's going on.
You've got it exactly right. SDA, it's like the intelligence that guides everything we do. It keeps our people safe, and it's the foundation for everything we'll do in space in the future.
So we've covered the core responsibilities of the U.S. Space Force, your marching orders, I think you called them, and the 5 core competencies. But I got to ask, when you talk about the space domain, what do we actually mean? Is it as simple as drawing a line in the sky and saying everything above this is space?
Great question, and it's one the Space Capstone Publication spends a lot of time on. It really digs into how we define space. It's not as simple as just an altitude, like a line on a map.
So how do we define it? What sets the space domain apart from the air or the ocean?
Instead of one definition, they break it down into 3 dimensions: physical, network, and cognitive.
Okay, now I'm really interested. 3 dimensions of space. Let's start with the obvious one. What's the physical dimension?
That's the one everyone pictures first, that vastness, all the planets and stars and galaxies. But it's also the environment that directly affects our spacecraft. It's about the different orbits you can be in, the challenges of being practically weightless, even the radiation that's always hitting everything.
It's easy to forget when you see those beautiful pictures of Earth from space,
Yeah.
but it's a really harsh environment up there.
Exactly. And getting that, understanding it, it's crucial for doing anything in space. It's why we build spacecraft to handle those crazy temperatures and the radiation. It's why we need life support for astronauts. It's why we're always watching out for space junk.
Speaking of space junk, aren't we making that problem worse every time we send something new up there?
That's a big concern, definitely. The Space Capstone Publication talks about this a lot. It's like we're polluting our own workspace, and if we don't start being careful, we could really mess things up for everyone.
That is a little scary. Sounds like taking care of space is just as important as taking care of Earth.
You got it. We have to be responsible up there, just like down here, if we want it to last.
Okay, so that's the physical side of space. You also mentioned a network dimension. What's that all about?
Think about it this way. None of our stuff in space exists on its own. Every satellite, every spacecraft, it's all connected. They're all nodes on this giant web that goes all over the planet.
So the network dimension, that's like the connections between everything.
Exactly. Those connections let us talk to our satellites, control where they go, and get all the important info they're gathering.
But wouldn't that make those connections really tempting targets?
That's the thing. The Space Capstone Publication makes it clear that being so connected, it makes us vulnerable. If someone can disrupt those communications, jam our signals, or hack our systems on the ground, they can really mess things up in space without even touching a satellite.
So it's like going after the control center instead of every individual satellite.
Exactly. Which is why this network dimension is so important. Protecting it, it means making our stuff on the ground really secure, coming up with communication systems that are hard to break, and having backups in case something does go wrong.
Crazy to think how important that network is to everything we do in space. So we've got the environment itself, we've got the network that ties everything together. What about that third dimension you mentioned, the cognitive one? The cognitive dimension. That sounds kind of deep when you put it like that. Are we about to get all philosophical about space?
Not exactly philosophical,
Yeah.
but it is about the human element of all this space stuff. It's about how we think about space, the mental models we use, even how people's minds react when you're up there in this totally alien environment.
So it's not enough to just have the best technology. You need the right mindset to actually use it right.
Exactly. Think about it. Our whole sense of distance, of time, even which way is up, it all gets flipped on its head when you leave Earth. What seems like a huge distance to us might be nothing in space. Or you try to make a simple maneuver, and it takes days because of how orbits work.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And that's why this cognitive stuff matters. We have to train our space professionals to think in new ways, to handle this crazy environment and make decisions under pressure because the stakes are huge.
So we're not just teaching pilots how to fly a spaceship, we're teaching them how to think like spacefarers.
You got it. It's about building a whole culture of innovation and creativity and strategic thinking in the Space Force, understanding that the next big thing in space, it might not be some new gadget, it might be a whole new way of thinking.
I like that. A new way of thinking.
The Space Capstone Publication, it makes it clear we're still figuring all this out, figuring out how to really operate in space. It talks about constantly learning, always adapting, always pushing the limits of what we think is possible.
That's pretty inspiring. So if you're in the U.S. Space Force, you're thinking about those three dimensions of space, the physical, the network, and this cognitive one. How does that actually play out in your job? How do you put it into action?
It changes how you approach everything. You're always thinking, what if? What if our satellites get attacked? What if our communications go down? What if something happens halfway across the world and we need to respond now? Those aren't just hypotheticals. That's the reality we're dealing with.
You always be ready, always be able to adapt.
Exactly. No matter what your job is, you got to own it, understand how it fits into that big picture of space power.
You're not just launching rockets or watching screens. You're building the future, writing the next chapter.
And for everyone listening out there, the next time you look up at the stars, think about that. The future of space, it's in your hands.